Australia will experience the biggest 2-year population surge in our history. Who's going to be honest enough to say that there's nowhere for these people to live?
The housing crisis in Australia has morphed in the past 12 months from one that was just focused on the unaffordable price of buying a house or renting one to the bigger underlying issue that we just don't have enough houses for our population.
There's been quite a lot of disruption as a result of the pandemic. Firstly, in terms of migration numbers, migration stopped, and in fact we had an exodus of quite a bit of the housing construction workforce moving back overseas to countries of origin. Beyond that, then there were supply chain issues that came as a result of constraints through the pandemic shutdown period that are still reverberating through systems internationally now. So feasibility studies on sites done before the pandemic are now largely worthless.
That's some of the supply shocks the market is dealing with. Then there is demand.
Well, I think, what the pandemic taught us is how we use our housing has changed. I mean, increasingly, as many people are able to work from home and choose to work flexibly from home a proportion of the time, their needs have changed.
Michael Fotheringham says migration has a marginal impact compared to changes in the way we use housing.
We're talking about a relatively small number of people. The majority of migrants are actually temporary migrants, and the largest group of those are international students who tend to live in student accommodation purpose-built for that. The rise in single-person households and two-person households. So rather than have 3 or 4 people in every dwelling, we've got many dwellings with only 1 person in them or only 2 people in them. That has a bigger impact than migration.
In his reply to the federal budget last week, Peter Dutton linked the hot-button issue of a housing crisis to high levels of migration.
Australians are struggling to find homes to rent and buy, and it's not always due to a lack of money. Amidst this housing crisis, Labor is bringing in 1.67 million migrants over 5 years, more than the population of Adelaide. We believe that by rebalancing the migration program and taking decisive action on the housing crisis, the Coalition can free up almost 40,000 additional homes in the first year.
He has not been the only political leader to jump on the housing migration bandwagon.
The level of migration we're currently experiencing in Queensland is putting too much pressure on our housing system. So I welcome Peter Dutton echoing my comments.
Permanent visa holders, the traditional basis of our migration scheme, now represent only a very small proportion of total migration. The total number of people arriving in Australia each year is now dominated by temporary visa holders, including international students. The total net number of people arriving and departing each year is known as the Net Overseas Migration Number, or NOM. In his budget reply, Peter Dutton spoke of only cutting the permanent migration stream by 25%, from 185,000 to 140,000 for the first 2 years. But that puzzled those who closely follow the migration debate.
Peter Dutton's proposal to cut the permanent migration program from 185,000 to 140,000 people won't really make much difference to the number of people arriving in Australia. About 60% of the people who become permanent residents are already here. So cutting the permanent numbers doesn't stop more people coming as students, working holiday makers, skilled workers and so on.
This afternoon at the National Press Club, his Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor confirmed the Dutton government actually planned to cut net overseas migration by 25% in its first term.
There's been a massive escalation in those numbers in the last couple of years, and we think we can achieve a NOM, that's the net migration in Australia, which is consistent with a level of housing supply that is realistic. You can't move housing supply overnight, and so you've got to bring those two numbers into line.
Sorry, so just to confirm, you're saying a 25% cut in the net overseas migration rate?
That's right.
If we wanted to cut temporary migration, that's going to require detailed policy work to work out how to do it. The government is proposing caps on student numbers, but its draft legislation is quite complicated, and we can expect a lot of pushback from universities and other training providers. And even if you implemented that now, it would take some time for it to come into effect. So to cut to the chase, there is no easy way to simply cut net overseas migration by 100,000 per year And promising to do that is really quite misleading, I think.
Peter Dutton claimed last week that the government was predicting 528,000 net arrivals this year. That's wrong. That is the number reported in the budget papers as of June last year. The expected number for the financial year ending next month is 395,000. It is forecast to fall to 260,000 next year. But what must come under particular scrutiny is the opposition leader's suggestion that overall migration has blown out to unprecedented levels under Labor. Just how big a change has there been in net overseas migration in the last 2 and indeed 6 years?
The Albanese government has now created a big Australia policy. They didn't tell anybody about it before the election. They've just sprung it on people.
The budget papers forecast that for the 5 years ending 2026-27, net overseas migration will indeed be 1.673 million people. But the budget papers of the last Frydenberg budget in 2019, before the pandemic struck, forecast that for the 5 years ending 2022, net overseas migration would be 1.334 million. In other words, only about 340,000 more over the 5 years than the previous government had expected.
Overall, over that time, the numbers are no greater than we anticipated. It's just that we've gone from sort of feast to famine, as it were, or famine to feast. We've gone from a sudden drop in immigration and lots of people leaving to a sudden surge in immigration. And that's much harder for us all to manage.
The surge was particularly due to international students flooding back into the country. And why was that?
So students will have no hour restrictions on them being able to be available for work in Australia if they're already here.
A week later, there was more.
We will be rebating the visa application fees from all those who arrive today and going forward. And that is a thank you to them for coming back and continuing to choose Australia.
In essence, the student visa became a low-skill work visa. And it was promised that way marketed that way by education agents, by universities and by migration agents. The system just boomed.
They doubled the amount of time international students can work, lifting it from 20 to 40 hours a week.
The Albanese government has been gradually introducing measures to make Australia a less attractive option for those seeking to come here to work on student visas, including by trying to clean up dodgy education providers.
It's raising quite significantly, increasing the amount that students have to show in savings before they can come to Australia.
The current government has also taken other steps in recent months to dampen temporary migration, including lifting the threshold for English language proficiency for students, lifting visa fees, and also tightening rules around post-study work visas. But is it actually possible to cut net overseas migration more radically? What would Abul Rizvi be advising Peter Dutton if he was still a senior immigration bureaucrat?
I would be advising him to deal with a wide cross-section of visas rather than just focus on overseas students as he has to date. They do need to tighten visas in the working holidaymaker area, in skilled temporary entry, in visitors extending stay. All of those areas have to be addressed if he's going to get the numbers down in a balanced way. The problem is going to be that a number of those visas disproportionately benefit regional Australia.
A key reason why Peter Dutton may have been coy about mentioning cuts to net overseas migration rather than just permanent migration is the Nationals. The rural party relies on international students at regional universities, as well as workers in both agriculture and to fill huge gaps in the health workforce.
We don't want to see the region suffer because of an exacerbated problem in capital cities.
At the National Press Club today, Angus Taylor criticised the current government for relying on immigration to keep the economy afloat. Among the questions that will have to be debated in the lead-up to next year's election is whether cutting migration along the lines the coalition suggests might appease those looking for a quick housing fix, but at the cost of tanking the economy.